Well, thank you so much. I must say that I appreciate all of you going on today and spending the hour with me and with Nancy. I, as I was saying a little earlier, I have the opportunity to meet so many of you across the nation, and I know, or certainly been told how busy, incredibly busy you are. So I appreciate you just taking the time to spend with us. This is one of my more favorite topics, actually. As a clinical and organizational psychologist, I've been coaching. Actually, I started to think about it and I realized that I have been coaching for almost 25 years, which actually clearly ages me. So it made me a little worried, but otherwise I was realizing how long that I've been doing coaching as part of my professional career. For me, when we start to understand some of the neurosciences, we start to also understand the power of what coaching can actually provide for people. So here's some of the topics that I'm going to talk about today. And certainly we're going to have some polling questions, and hopefully we'll get some questions also from you. Neuroscience and coaching. All of my postgraduate studies have been in the neurosciences. I have discovered that the power of neuroscience today is understanding actually why we want to coach a certain way, why it is that we want to manage people a certain way. So we'll have a chance to talk about that. And at the risk of boring any of you, I'll apologize now. I'm going to talk a little bit about actually how the brain works, specifically around reward versus threat, when the brain can be threatened or the brain can feel rewarded. We're also going to talk about some research best practices. I'm going to also discuss applying the SCARF model. The David Rock Neuro Leadership SCARF model is one of the best models that I have found today to really understand how our brains work at work and how we can be affected by specifically the relationships we have at work. We're going to talk about how to ignite coaching potential, as well as strategies to optimize change. So we're going to start with a poll, if you don't mind. And here's the question. What are the most important goals, in your opinion, in coaching and social services? And I think Nancy will pull up the poll.
I was talking to you, but you couldn't hear me. Sorry about that. I was on mute.
Okay, so we don't have anything up there. It just says this, that, the other, Nancy.
Oh, then I pulled up the wrong one. Hold on just a second. That's kind of comical.
I like this, that, the other, though. It's kind of, that's perfect.
That was kind of funny.
It's still up there.
Okay, here we go. I think we've got the right one. Is this the right one, Beth?
That's perfect.
Yay, thank you.
What are the most important goals in coaching and social services? Creating healthy and productive workplaces, guiding transformational and integrative change, igniting work potential, or all the above?
Okay, we're getting some last few more seconds to answer the question. People are still responding. I think they're getting it, Beth. All right, I'm going to end the polling and share the results.
Fantastic. So if we start to talk about coaching from a brain-based perspective, we're going to start to realize that coaching can go beyond problem-solving, skill building, and goal setting. Please understand, I'm not in any way saying that those are not also important. Those are vitally important when we are guiding and assisting people to kind of gain additional insight. However, after years of coaching, I realized that if we can move our goals toward transformational and integrative brain changes, if we can move our goals taking into account health and well-being of our coachee, one thing that I see over and over again in social services is that there are health and well-being issues that go on as a result of the stressors of the work itself, as a result of the client base, and as a result of the organizational challenges. So I take that in mind. And the third is, how do we ignite workforce potential? Whether it's with our coachee or is with those that our coachee works with and for. So I say this because all three are very important to keep in mind as we are working and building our intervention plans and our work and goals with our coaches. I want to move to talk to you a little bit about igniting the potential. I've had this fantastic opportunity to partner with American Public Human Services Association, which I only know it as APHSA. They're out of DC, and I am one of the thought leaders for a brand new national initiative that actually for the first time is looking at workforce health and well-being for human services. I say this because it's incredibly exciting for me. It's something that I have been beating the drum about in terms of all of the social services professionals that I meet and my concerns about health and well-being because of certain aspects of the work itself and the expectations. So we have now put together an initiative. We've been working on it for almost a year. I'm working on it with leaders in DC as well as government leaders around the country. And we are looking at, the goal is this: thriving cultures equal thriving communities. So we want to make sure the organizational cultures are thriving so that we can keep assisting in communities. And there are 5, as you can see, areas that specifically we're looking at. And the best part for me is we're going to do this initiative by applying neuroscience to 21st century social and human service, culture, mindsets, and beliefs. In other words, if I say this really clearly, we need to change the way in which we run these organizations so that our communities can be better served. In other words, if I say it more plainly, is that we need to take better care of you. And that's our goal in this initiative. Please, you'll hear more about this goal, and I have some articles if anyone's interested. I'm happy to send them out. So as we launch into the neurosciences, I want to think about 4 different main areas we're going to sort of look at in terms of neuroscience, social neuroscience research. Social neuroscience actually is that research in which we are having a relationship with each other. So it is social experiences, whether it's at work, whether it's at home, wherever it is. One area we're going to talk about is neuroplasticity, the ability to build new neural pathways. The research on neuroplasticity is stunning because we used to think in the old days that the only way that essentially after we were born, our brain was pretty fixed at 5 years old. By 5 years old, that was it, which if you think about it, would kind of leave us all as thinking like kindergartners. So we know that that's not true. But with the research now on the neurosciences and with the MRIs, we now know that building new neural pathways, we can do that at any age, but we must do it certain ways, and we'll have a chance to talk about both neuroplasticity and what's called neurogenesis, which is also being able to build actually new neurons. We're also going to talk about the brain. Our brains are built to be intensely social. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that we are continuously, even from our ancestors, we are continuously searching and perceiving our environments to make sure that we are either safe or not safe in every situation. Each time we are interacting, each time we are meeting someone, each time we are having a conversation, we are highly alert. We're on alert to look and understand what it is that's going on for us socially. That is just how we're wired. And we're wired because if we think about our ancestors for a moment, survival was very important. So that is one of our primary driving forces as human beings, is to make sure we can survive. As a result, we have these mechanisms inside of us that will either detect threat or will detect reward. And we're going to talk about that a little more in a few minutes. So what is neuroplasticity? Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to build new neural connections at any age. Now, we do that by a number of ways. We can do that by learning new things. We can do that by practicing mindfulness practices like meditation, the mindfulness, anything that is meditative. We know that just the act of breathing in and breathing out allows us to actually build new neural connections. It's quite stunning, actually. I have the opportunity to teach. As of actually 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity and I reached past the 18,000 mark of being able to teach those in workplaces only how to do mindful meditation. And I teach because I work with so many human services professionals. And the truth is that we need ways not only to manage stress, but we also need ways to be able to avoid burnout and secondary trauma. There's other ways as well. Exercise is another way to build neuroplasticity. And one of the keys that many people don't realize is that the act of learning new things, new activities, novel things are really the key to building the most robust and rerouting our neural connections. If any time we build a new habit, we create a new habit, we are building new neural connections. Now, at the risk of anyone saying that this is boring, I'm going to try to do this as fast as possible. Because actually this slide, to be quite honest with you, is probably one of the most important slides in our discussion today. The tripartite brain model. You can see an MRI here of a brain. I'm going to talk about 3 specific parts of the brain, although I promise you that our brains are much more complex than just the 3 parts I'm going to discuss. But these 3 parts are what really get affected when we are in the workplace, when we are working with individuals as coaches, and it's very important to understand these 3 parts of our brain. The first part is the neocortex. Our neocortex is our logical, and it's the blue part, if you guys can see. It's our logical, rational, reasoning part of our brain. It's where we acquire knowledge. It makes the neocortex, it makes up 76% of our brain, although there's a part right in front of our brain, which is where the blue area is, which is called the prefrontal cortex. That is where we do most of what we call our executive functioning activities. And that's where we plan, we organize ourselves, we're able to make our decisions. The prefrontal lobe is very, very important. Now, if you think about the neocortex, that is where we do most of our thinking. However, there is another small part of the brain. That red area right there is very small, but it's called the limbic system. And it's purposely put in red, by the way, because it is where we experience the alarms, the alarming issues in our lives, such as fear, where we'll take in threatful emotions. We can take in strong emotions. And it's also where as human beings, we store our trauma. Now, what do I mean by that? Right behind that red area, there's a little area called the hippocampus, and that is our memory centers. And that is where we will store traumas. But we will also store all the other information that comes in through our senses, from our eyes, our ears, our olfactory senses, others, even taste. And we can store our information coming in through the neocortex, or we can store it coming in through the limbic system, all depending on how it is we emotionally perceive that information. Now, if in fact we have information coming in through the limbic system, it will kick off this green part of our reptilian brain, and there will be one of 3 things that our bodies will prepare to do. We will fight, freeze, or flee. Now, most of you probably have studied this area before, right? The fight, freeze, or flee response. The interesting piece, though, that's important to note is that when the limbic activity goes off, all of the oxygen and glucose that is around our neocortex, our thinking brain, runs immediately to the limbic. So our ability to think clearly, if we are in limbic, sort of a threatened state, is very, very difficult. Matter of fact, many of you have experienced this. Many of you may have had the opportunity to all of a sudden, let's say, have to do some public speaking. Some of you may not like public speaking. And the moment you stand up to talk and you've prepared flawlessly, and though the moment you stand up to talk, you realize that you've lost access to yourself. You can't think clearly. And your heart starts to palpitate, you start to sweat a little bit, and you realize that you may be going to faint because it feels so incredibly uncomfortable to be in front of an audience. That is where you move from the neocortex activity to the limbic activity. And many, by the way, as we know, want to flee the moment we stand up because we can't wait for it to be over with. So let me talk to you about the physiology of threat, the costs that we experience. So we already know cognitively we can't think clearly if we are in a threat response, which is the limbic activity and the reptilian brain. We know biochemically all of a sudden we will start to secrete those stress hormones called cortisol. We'll start to secrete adrenaline just in case if there was a real threat we would need to run. We physiologically will do that sweating, our heart rate will go up. We even digest our food really quickly, just in case there was a real threat, let's say a tiger coming into a room. We want to be able to run or maybe fight if we wanted to or needed to, or sometimes we just freeze. And with all this process, one of the key issues here is we end up with what we call some emotional dysregulation, meaning that it's hard for us to manage sometimes the emotions themselves, because once a threat is detected, we have to remember that that rational part of our brain, the neocortex, goes what we call in my business offline, meaning that all the oxygen and glucose as it's run to the limbic is not going to allow us to think clearly. So I need to talk a moment about anthropology. Let's talk about what were our ancestors' main threats and concerns. If anybody wants to weigh in, please do. One of them clearly was loss of life or physical injury. It was pretty dangerous to be in caves, right? To live in caves, especially if you didn't have a large enough clan or tribe. Hence, it was sort of interesting because what we found was that the research found is that the anthropologically that the larger a tribe, the safer people could be. We also know that they were foraging for food continuously. People would die from starvation. They needed water. There were different kinds of threats than we probably have today, given that there were large animals that could take people's lives. But we have threats that are today also that many of our ancestors didn't deal with. That's including social and psychological threats today. So still, unfortunately, we know that there are some individuals that have still those physical injury and physical life threats, the fear of in certain locations and in certain parts of the world, as well in America. But we also know that today, especially in the workplace, we see that social and psychological threats dominate most workplaces. Now, in public service, specifically in social services, because your customer base tends to have significant histories of trauma, as well as crises, and quite often they're entering your environment, your work environment, because they're in crises, that there are a higher amount of significant social and psychological aspects of threat that can come across your desks versus others as a result of the style of your work, as a result of the work itself. There's also, we see today, humiliation and shame is a gigantic issue in terms of creating and kicking off threat for people. When a workplace is designed to unfortunately shame or humiliate, we will know immediately we will move into a limbic activity and we will unable to work very efficiently. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I know that whenever my boss said to me that could I please come into her office, I immediately would have a heart shudder. Now, my boss, one of my favorite bosses, was absolutely the kindest human being I've ever met. I know that she never meant anything except, Beth, let's go into my office and talk. But it didn't matter. Just the act of my boss asking me to come into her office made me move immediately into that level of fear, and that fear that somehow I was going to end up being shamed by something I did wrong. Think about whether or not you've had that experience. Most people I talk to, many people I talk to, have told me they have. Especially, I learned as a manager to be able to tell my staff exactly why I wanted them to come into the office once I realized that they too were having the heart palpitations that I would have. There's also areas of helpless and loss of control today that many of us feel that kicks off our threat responses. And unfairness is a fascinating issue. We're going to talk about unfairness more when we get to the SCARF model, but I need to tell you that it's not just human beings that detect unfairness. Research around animals like dogs and chimpanzees, even monkeys, we have some research around monkeys that show how it is that they experience unfairness, just as human beings. We don't like it. It kicks off an immediate feeling of limbic activity where we feel threat, where we get triggered. Let me play a video for you for a moment. See what you think.
So finally, experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs and with birds and with chimpanzees, but with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done that, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest you see here.
So some interesting aspects, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I think it's most definitely one of my favorite ones. It certainly allows us to understand the animal, not only in animals, but that part of us that is also animalistic as well. If you, just a little more about that research, quite often, those of you in social services get very concerned that that first capuchin monkey did not end up getting a grape. So I want you to know that I have reached out to the researchers, and you need to know that the good news is that not only did that monkey get grapes, but there is an instinctual aspect to capuchin monkeys, similar to human beings, in which the second monkey that was getting the grapes actually experienced discomfort around the level of unfairness and began to want to share the grapes, and did in fact share the grapes with the other monkeys. So that research study is absolutely fascinating in terms of even understanding the moral code that monkeys have, because they shared and wanted to share the grapes and didn't want to have what was just favorite. So let's talk a moment about the threat response of the brain. The threat response of the brain, as we said earlier, causes the neocortex itself to go offline. It also causes stress neurochemicals, right? So we're going to get ready, our body is going to get ready for an expectation that something dangerous is coming along. Now, as I said earlier, if that's a tiger or someone is trying to harm us physically, I think that's fantastic. We need this part of our brain. We do not want to lose this part of our brain. However, we also know that we get those triggers psychologically and socially in the same exact areas, not only of our brain, but in the same exact areas of our body as we would if in fact it was a real survival threat. So we are going to act as if it'll be survival at any cost. Now, what happens at that point, unfortunately, is we move out of a level of well-being, it takes a big toll for our bodies to be able to be in that survival mode. It takes a big toll because our bodies are meant to be in a more relaxed state, in what we call the parasympathetic nervous system state versus what's called the sympathetic nervous system state, which is ready to fight, flee, or freeze if we need something dangerous is happening. So not only is well-being compromised, but also our ability to thrive when we're in that state. The other piece too is that you will notice that during that state, ability to learn, relate, think clearly will all be diminished. In other words, if you have a boss that is continuously scaring you, so for example, many of you have made a mistake at work. I know I certainly have. I made a big error once. Now, I will remember going to one boss who at that time will never go down as my favorite because I made this error and they created a tremendous amount of shame for me. I was a new employee. I didn't realize that I made the error. I have to tell you, their statement to me was, please don't make that mistake again. I have to tell you, within a week's time, I made that mistake again. I was so nervous about making the mistake again, I made the mistake again. And part of it is because if we are feeling that experience, we will move into our limbic activity and we will not be able to think as clearly. So as you're coaching, you might want to think about this. How much do we need to make sure that we are not igniting threat for our coachees? So here's a poll for a moment. What aspects of work trigger your threat response?
Okay, everybody should be able to see it now.
Difficult cases, organizational challenges and frustrations, workloads and job duties, supervisory relationships, all of the above, and there be maybe more that I missed. But these are ones that certainly, anecdotally, I hear continuously. By the way, this question is going to be one of those questions that will be a very important question that we address in the Igniting the Potential initiative. Go ahead, Nancy.
Okay, a few last minute folks are answering. I'll end it. Okay. Here we go. Everybody should be able to see it now.
So not unusually, organizational challenges and frustrations, I find are most commonly the number one as we have here. But you can see across the board, we're not that far off across the board. For those of you that came up with that actually wrote all of the above that are triggers, I immediately go in from a clinical perspective, go into some concerns about your well-being, given that so much of this work itself is inherently stressful. So it's just something to think about. Thanks, Nancy.
Yep.
So let's talk about reward response. Let's get more positive here, please. The reward response of the brain is that part of our brain. Not only is our neocortex alive and well, we are able to think clearly, but when we feel rewarded, and interestingly, if you think about it, I would love to win the lottery. I don't know about you guys, but I would love to win the lottery. But just the act of being able to say to an individual at work or your coachee, I think that decision was fantastic. I think it was well thought out. What it is that your behavior and action plan really was right on. That in itself, when people feel valued and experience value, the same receptors that go off in the brain for rewards such as feeling valued, acknowledged, and important, having status, is the same as if we win the lottery. Now, I'm not sure that I wouldn't be a little higher if I won the lottery than perhaps someone telling me what a great job I'm doing, but nonetheless, we know that it's in the exact same region of the brain. We will immediately, upon feeling rewarded, we will immediately experience what we call pleasure neurochemicals. Those include neurochemicals such as serotonin, which elevates the mood. It includes norepinephrine, which is another mood elevator. We will end up having a dopamine hit, which really the dopamine is like makes you feel high. And sometimes we'll also experience, if it's relational, oxytocin, which is what we call the love neurochemical. We also see when we are operating from a coaching perspective, from a workforce sort of well-being and thriving perspective, we will see that people will start to feel better. They'll start to work more productively, and we'll notice that we increase organizational health. So the bottom line is that when we're working as coaches, we want to see how can we ignite the reward center enough so that we build that trust, we build that rapport, so that, and even when we're talking about issues that may be concerning or difficult, we can still have the opportunity for individuals to not have to go into their threat response when we're talking about that hard stuff. Here's a poll for you. What are the most rewarding aspects of your work? Meaning and purpose from being in service to others, relationship work, financial compensation, intellectual stimulation. And again, I'm sure there's many more.
So far, nobody's chosen financial compensation, Beth.
And how can I not be surprised? Well, here's what's fascinating. Take a look, Nancy. Wait till you guys see the end poll results. Fascinating.
And they're coming up just a few minutes. Somebody can still select financial compensation.
Just for the heck of it.
Yeah.
I'm tempted.
Okay, I'm going to end the polling and share the results.
So guys, take a look at this. 74% of you, out of these four, I'm sure there may be others, but out of these four, chose meaning and purpose from being in service to others. This is one of the hallmarks that I see when I'm speaking to those of you that do this work. And it's one of the reasons that it makes you so incredibly capable to do the work you do. But I need to tell you that it also can really be quite exhausting. This work can be exhausting, and and it's fascinating to me in terms of results. So thank you.
Hey, Beth.
Yes.
I've got a question here that I thought maybe we could just take 2 seconds from Nicholas Ortiz that asks if it's a mischaracterization to label oxytocin as a love chemical.
Is it a mischaracterization? I think that's a great question. Actually, Nicholas.
I thought it was a great one too. So thank you. Thank you, Nicholas.
Yeah, no, thank you, Nicholas. Actually, one of the reasons why it's considered the love neurochemical is because they first noted that the oxytocin flow between babies and children, babies and parents, actually what we see is that it's a vital, very important for bonding. So one of the reasons it's considered the love neurochemical is because we know that the secretion of oxytocin, both for babies and for parents, is very important. Some of the newer research now shows that for those of you who may not like children, you get the same kick with dogs. Unfortunately, it didn't come up with cats, but with dogs. So I don't know if that answered your question, Nicholas, but that's certainly why it is that many of us just call it the love neurochemical. So so we're going to move into the SCARF model and apply what I'd like you to think about this. And by the way, you're going to see down below, I've provided you with a self-assessment. Feel free to go on at some point on the self-assessment. It should take you about 5 to 10 minutes to fill out. It is a free self-assessment from the Neuroleadership Institute. I've had the wonderful opportunity to be a part of that Neuroleadership Institute for a number of years, as well as to do a lot of my postgraduate work with them. And they are an awesome group. So what happened was David Rock, who is the head of the Neuroleadership Institute, had a great interest in understanding in the workplace what creates social threats and rewards, and how is it specifically, how are people affected? What happens if we move away from the threat response and move toward the reward response when we are working in workplaces? So if we take that a little more to public service, you'll see, well, let me go back here for a moment. You will see that he found 5 different specific and put them under their status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. These 5 aspects specifically, if in fact these 5 aspects are in fact threatened at different points in time, we will see a tremendous amount of limbic activity and an inability to be very effective at work. Or if we in fact go toward rewarding these aspects, we will see organizational health, as I said earlier, and we will see individual well-being increase significantly, productivity, engagement, et cetera, et cetera. So let me start with the first one. First one is status. Status is probably one of the most interesting areas of the research. Now, one thing that I like about the Neuro Leadership Institute specifically is that they are a think tank, but they use universities all over the world to do their research. And as we know, academia tends to be a little just more objective than if we were all just throwing that research out from underneath their own institute. So I say this because if we think about status for a moment, what is status? Status they defined as a perception of one's own importance at work. Now, our perceptions may not necessarily equal where we are in the hierarchy. Our perceptions may not equal where we are, our positions themselves. So what we really wanted to look at, and they found, was status itself has the largest reward when individuals understand their contributions at work. Now, as a coach, one thing that I make sure I start out very early on is to be able to talk about how it is do you contribute, how do you contribute to the whole of your department? How do you contribute to the whole of your organization? And I have to tell you, quite often, many people have never thought of that. No boss has ever explained it. And sometimes I'll just have my coachees say to me, oh, I don't know, I just do what I do day in and day out. That's my contribution. When in fact, part of the importance is understanding how are they, or what's their perception of their own importance, and it's based in contribution. Now, if I say this a little more clearly, I can say it this way too. Most of us know someone in an organization that does not have the hierarchical position. They may not be in a senior leadership position, but we know that they have so much power within their department or their organization based on who they are, based on their knowledge base, sometimes based on how long they've been there. So I say that because think about it for a moment. Who do you know that has status without necessarily the leadership moniker behind him or behind her? How do we create status? And this is an area where I work very clearly and carefully with my coachees. One way is that I'd like to be able to acknowledge and really own and help them own where are their strengths, what is their expertise, where do they find value? I like to acknowledge that. I want to be able to help them understand where they are valuable. The other part is that if we provide non-judgmental feedback, people tend to hear it. Now, what does that mean? That means that quite often, if someone detects judgment, you know they're going to go into the limbic. You know they're going to feel threat. So part of building that rapport so that your coachees understand that you're not here to judge, that in fact, I'm just a guide for you to help you understand or to help you grow in ways or to help you transform or to help you ignite something that perhaps you don't know about, have not been able to ignite yet, or even perhaps to change a mindset or a belief. If we do it non-judgmentally, I can tell you, we will have a greater chance of success of this individual growing in those directions. Now, we also see that status in workplaces, when a boss, when the organization focuses on professional development, acknowledges the importance of growth, allows and provides mentors, which is probably one of the most powerful aspects of, I know the UC Davis coaching process is phenomenal. We have the opportunity to go in and actually talk to those of you in social services that might need some guidance. And that doesn't mean that something's wrong. That just means that all of us need guidance. We can always do better at what we're doing, but all of it can either threaten status or reward the sense of status. Now, the second is certainty. And I believe one of you asked this question about how much uncertainty or how much stress should we actually induce or help perhaps for individuals. How much can they tolerate before they move into a threat response? What the research showed around certainty, which we know enough uncertainty in any organizational structure, will create some level of threat. So uncertainty itself, but the research was really interesting about this. Mild uncertainty actually ignited an ability to be more productive and motivated. What the research showed, though, is it's excessive uncertainty that creates the most difficulty. It creates difficulty because excessive uncertainty, it overwhelms our nervous systems. We feel out of control. We feel frightened, perhaps, in uncertainty that we might lose our jobs. Any of that can trigger the threat response. But mild uncertainty, interestingly, and therefore I will say the same thing. If you look at the research on stress, there's something called eustress, E-U-E-A-U stress. I believe it's how it's spelled. Eustress is that mild amount of stress that's very important for us to continue to function. It's the excessive stress that actually creates problems for both our minds and our bodies. So certainty is this: our brain's preference for predictability and familiarity. Our brains are incredibly lazy, guys. They are so lazy, we prefer autopilot. I can ask you the question, how many of you drove to work today and don't even remember half the ride? That is the autopilot. So in order to move out of autopilot, to be productive, to be creative, to learn new things, we have to be able to experience some level of certainty, so that we can feel like we have that access to, so we have that access to our, the neocortex, that part of our rational brain. Also, part of certainty is making sure that we as coaches create very clear and honest messaging. Now, honest messaging doesn't mean that we whack somebody when we think they've done something wrong. It means that we we guide them toward coming up with their own answers, but we make sure that we're guiding them in a way that's very honest, because most people, by the way, know when we are not being honest with them. They can pick it up. We also want to make sure we align our work with the goals. Now, in coaching, it's really interesting because I make sure that I continuously discuss the process that they're going through and the growth in the process, as well as the small wins. And I find that coaches prefer this. They like to break something up into the process itself so that we can acknowledge small wins, so that each stage along the way of the process of growth is a win, in my opinion, because it's not easy to change mindsets, beliefs. It's not easy to do something different. And I can tell you, because I'm a little older, it gets more and more difficult the older we get. The third A in the SCARF model is autonomy. Now, our brains need choices. We know this from the research. The neuroscience research is stunning around this. But what's really interesting in terms of the research, and you can ask your coaches, how much autonomy do they have at work? Because some areas of significant stressors, are involved around the fact that many don't feel like they have enough autonomy. In other words, the opposite of autonomy is actually micromanaging. And by the way, I've never met a micromanager that knows that they're a micromanager. So you'll know that. Never met one. They don't really know it. They don't really realize it. But how much self-direction, and how as coaches can we also encourage self-direction? Now, internally, it's quite often in workplaces, we see choices about projects, creating their schedules, flex time, going to different trainings and having those choices. There's a difference between guiding versus dictating. And the best coaches guide someone toward the direction that they want, knowing that they may not be able to get there. The best coaches also assess capability as well as the willingness to get there. It's part of our responsibility. Relatedness is incredibly important, and it's the R in SCARF, and it's about inclusion. The basic human need is for us to feel like we belong and included. So here we go again. If we have strong social connections at work, if we have strong social connections with our coachees, we will experience that potential oxytocin. And what we even see is the social belonging. Many people will stay in communities, in work communities, where they feel like they belong, versus even making more money and going elsewhere and leading counties or leading state agencies. Other part of relatedness is very important, is to really encourage, and I say this to senior leaders all the time, don't get caught in a hierarchy. Don't make your staff get caught in one. Promote cross-organizational relationships. And the last but not the least is fairness. We talked about this earlier. The F in SCARF is about fairness. Perception of unfairness equals threat. And that can be very, very subtle around favoritism, around equity issues, when we find out that a colleague of ours is being paid more than us. Acknowledgement, we want to make sure we're authentic. We want to work from an adaptive, creating clear, consistent expectations. So here's the bottom line about coaching. If we're going to operate from a rewarding as a coach, a rewarding perspective, we're going to help rewire and we're going to help inspire. If we're guiding, let's guide from a very safe and trustworthy place where we build that rapport, we build that trust. And then how do we challenge? We want to challenge mindsets, we want to challenge beliefs, and we want to challenge actions, but not in a way that ignite the threat response to make someone wrong, but more in a way in which people can allow themselves, our coaches can allow themselves to actually question some of the things that they've always thought were right and perhaps aren't really working for them anymore. And this is just this is a book that I have, and my colleague Deborah Winograd have just recently, is about to be published actually in May, early May. And it's all about health and human services. And we wrote it up quite honestly out of frustration of not being able to find books like this. So it's called The Neuroscience Guide to Surviving and Thriving at Work. And it's all about human services and the things that we've seen over our combined 60 years of work. Thanks, Nancy.
No, thank you, Beth, very, very much. So we now have about 7 minutes for questions from the field. We have one easy question, which is, will the PowerPoint be available or emailed? And we have recorded the webinar and we'll post the webinar on our webpage. So you'll get information about that. And the next question we have, and please type in some questions that you'd like for us to, like Dr. Cohen, to answer. We've got, in Colorado, we're looking at the health, well-being, retention of workforce, and are there some options to engage with the APHSA and their research?
That is a yes, and and there is, I don't know where you're located in Colorado. I've done some work in some of the counties in Colorado. Some counties are already involved in some of it, and and please feel free to give out my information, Nancy, my email.
Great, excellent.
It might be my pleasure to talk with you. We're looking for participants.
And they're also looking for the name of your book, Beth. They missed it on the slide.
Oh, okay. It's Work Aches. Can I go back to the slide, Nancy?
Sure, absolutely.
Can you see? Is it visible?
There it is. Yep.
Work Aches, the Neuroscience Guide to Surviving and Thriving at Work.
And we are very anxious for this thing to be published and available to read.
Yes, it should be ready for pre-orders by the beginning of May. And I have to tell you, this was a labor of love, guys. It took me years to finally finish it. Both Deborah and I have worked on it for years.
Great. Okay, we've got another question. It's about if there's newsletters or ways to learn about upcoming trainings and questions. And we will send out emails and look at watch our website. We don't do necessarily a newsletter, but you'll have lots of opportunities to learn about what we're doing. Here we go. A question on recommendations for the measurement of the results of coaching. We have just started coaching all supervisors to create a coaching culture, from Dawn Johnson. Dawn, our first webinar in the recording is on our website, is on the benefits of coaching and what we know about the benefits of coaching, the research that has been done, some of the research that we're doing. So you can email me, my email is on the screen, nshafer@ucdavis.edu, and I'm happy to share with you some of those results and also the webinar link. With that, we do have our next webinar is coming up on May 9th, and it is on the topic of nurturing resilience via the use of coaching. And I can't remember the main title, and it's not on my screen. So May 9th is our next webinar. And then in June, we are co-hosting a webinar with the Child Welfare League of America on putting the pieces together between supervision and coaching. Roxanne Salazar has a question if there are any other resources on this topic that you could recommend.
Oh, absolutely. And if you would like, Nancy, we can add which I took off, but we can add the references. And I believe on
Oh
this,
yeah, that would be great.
so we'll add references on this PowerPoint, and then anyone who wants to go deeper can find the references from the research and from the different articles. So absolutely,
You know, Beth, I've read 2 books in the last year, and I'd love your thoughts. I read a book called Quiet Leadership by David Rock.
Oh, yes.
That I thought was just fabulous. And then I also read Conversational Intelligence by Judith Lasser that I thought was really quite interesting as well.
So what's really interesting and is exciting for me, Nancy, during this period of time is that we're looking at leadership from just such different aspects now. And also even personality styles of leaders. And how is it that we can become more authentic, more adaptive? Judith Lasser's stuff is fascinating in my opinion, because we're also looking at how can we move away from some of that, with David also talks about moving away from that hierarchic statement place, right? And move much more toward being able to relate to people in ways. So a lot of the new books you're gonna see out really involve how can we relate better to our employees? How can we relate better all across an organizational structure? So I don't know if that answers your full question, but there's some really fantastic resources today.
Okay, and then we also have a question on the name of the last book. So Crystal Montano asked that, but I don't know which was the name of the last book that we talked about. Conversational Intelligence. Oh, okay, Conversational Intelligence. I think that was the one. We have a date for the 3rd webinar is May 9th. So when you receive emails from us announcing these webinars, we are having an unsubscribe, a notice that comes up, and I myself actually hit the unsubscribe because it looks very formal from UC Davis Division of Continuing and Professional Education, so I even unsubscribed. But if you receive a coaching email from us, you will only get coaching emails from us. You will not open yourself up to the entire, University of California sending you emails. So just be cautious about hitting that unsubscribe. Because that's how we do communicate about the coaching. And I will send the link of our website and to everybody who participated. I'll send a follow-up email to everybody who participated with the link to the website and where you can find this webinar, as well as the SCARF self-assessment. I find that the SCARF self-assessment, you can really easily Google it. If you just select SCARF self-assessment, you'll find it. I think that brings us right up to 11 o'clock. So if anybody has a last minute question, you can type it in. Thank you all so much. And Beth, thank you. It's always a pleasure to see your face and have you talk your talk. So thank you for everything. And look for more information from us, everybody.
Thanks, Nancy.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.